Today, we are looking at The Art of Seduction by Robert Greene, a book that catalogs across history the psychological barriers behind how certain people have drawn others powerfully toward them, whether romantically, socially, or politically. Greene studied courtesans, con artists, and charismatic leaders, and legendary lovers across centuries, and organized what he found into a kind of taxonomy: seducer archetypes, phases of seduction, and psychological tactics. Is the honest framing I wanted to give this one up front. This is less a self-help book in the traditional sense and more a study of power and psychology, using seduction as the specific lens. Some leaders treat it as a practical playbook. I think the more useful way to engage with it, and the way we are going to approach it today, is a window into a set of very real, very old psychological barriers: attention, mystery, tension, timing, that show up constantly in human relations, whether or not anyone involved is consciously using them, and that are worth understanding both so you can recognize them in others, and so you can think honestly about whether the line sits between genuine connections and manipulation. By the end of this episode, you will understand Greene's core frame, the psychological principle underneath it that show up in real research on attraction, and just as importantly, whether this book's approach runs into serious ethical problems that are worth naming directly rather than glossing over. Robert Greene is best known for a series of books that study power, strategy, and influence through historical case studies, pulling partners from literary history, politics, business, and in this book, romantic and social seduction specifically. His method across all of these books is consistent: gather a huge number of historical examples, identifying recurring partners across them, and organize those partners into named categories and principles. That method has a real strengths and real limitations worth naming upfront. The strength is that they serve genuinely recurring psychological partners that show up again and again across very different times, cultures, and contexts, which suggests there is something real underneath them, not just coincidence. The limitation is that the book is descriptive rather than prescriptive in the way a science-based psychology book would be. It's built from historical pattern matching and Greene's own interpretation of famous seducers, not controlled research, and it does not spend much time on the ethics of the tactics it catalogs, which is something we are going to address directly later in this episode rather than skip past. His frame is seduction not narrowly as a romantic or sexual pursuit, but as a general process of drawing someone's attention and a desire toward you through a deliberate, gradually escalating sequence, a process he argues shows up in political leadership, business persuasion, and social influence just as much as it shows up in romantic pursuit. The common thread across all of those contexts in his framing is the deliberate management of another person's attention, curiosity, and emotional state over time, rather than a single moment of persuasion. Central to his framework is the idea of psychological attention, the state of being pulled toward something you don't yet fully have or understand. He argues human attention is drawing far more powerfully toward ambiguity, mystery, and a sense of incompleteness than toward anything fully known, explained, or immediately available. A person who reveals everything about themselves immediately in his framing generates far less than someone who reveals just enough to create curiosity while withholding enough to sustain it, an idea that echoes something psychologists actually have studied under the umbrella of the mere exposure effect, running into its own limits, and the well-documented tendency for people to be more drawn to things that carry some degree of scarcity or incompleteness rather than instant and total availability. This reframing is useful even independent of romantic specifically. It maps onto why compelling stories are built around gradually revealed information rather than immediate exposition. Why the most memorable public speakers create anticipation rather than delivering everything in the first sentence, and why marketing built around mystery or exclusivity tends to outperform marketing that simply states every fact about a product immediately. Greene's specific application is romantic and social seduction, but the underlying attention mechanism he's describing shows up well beyond that narrow context. Among the archetypes he identifies, the serene, who generates desire through an aura of unrestrained pleasure and a sensory abundance, drawing people in through the promise of intensity and excitement. The ray, who generates desire through an aura of dangerous unpredictability and a total, undivided attention while it is given. Even though the attention is famously impermanent, the ideal lover, who generates desire by intuiting and reflecting back exactly what the other person seems to want or need, becoming a kind of mirror for their specific fantasy. The dandy, who generates desire through an impetuous, boundary-blurring charisma that doesn't fit neatly into expected categories, making them memorable and hard to fully place, and several others, including the charmer, the natural, and the star, each built around a distinct psychological hook. It's worth nothing explicitly that Greene is not arguing any single leader should try to adapt one of these archetypes wholesale as a costume. His broader point, made across the chapter, is that each archetype represents a genuine, recognizable psychological banner that shows up repeatedly in people who draw strong attention and attraction, often without those people consciously studying or using the banner at all. Some people simply embody one of these banners naturally, as a byproduct of their genuine personality rather than deploying it strategically. The value of naming the archetypes from a listener's standpoint is less about deliberately performing one and more about recognizing the banner where you encounter it in others, and honestly sometimes in tendencies you already have yourself. Greene also catalogs what he calls types of targets. Recurring personality are more or less susceptible to seduction and more or less suited to different seducer archetypes. This section of the book has drawn real criticism, and I think that criticism is a fair, framing other people primarily as targets to be strategically read and approached, rather than as a full individuals with their own equal agency in any interaction, sits at the uncomfortable core of what makes this particular book more ethically flawed than most of what we cover on this show. A framework that treats another person's psychology mainly as a set of exploitable levers is fundamentally different thing than a framework that helps you understand your own banners or communicate more genuinely. That said, there is a more defensible, narrower version of this same information worth extracting, understanding that different people respond differently to different kinds of attention, and that genuine compatibility involves paying real attention to what actually resonates with a specific other person, rather than using a single generic approach on everyone. Is a reasonable and a fairly beginning insight on its own. The line between pay attention to what genuinely matters to this specific person because you care about connecting with them and identifying their psychological vulnerabilities in order to strategically exploit them is a significant one, and it is a line this section of the book doesn't draw as carefully it should be. We'll come back to this distinction directly in a later segment because I think it is the single most important thing to take away from this particular book. The early phase involves selecting the right target and generating initial interest, creating a sense of intrigue, often through some form of calculated distance or unavailability rather than immediate total accessibility. The middle phases involve a deepening emotion investment, creating a sense of pleasure and anticipation associated specifically with you, while also introducing enough uncertainty or unpredictability that attention does not settle into a comfortable, fully resolved state too quickly. Later phases involve what Greene calls breaking down final resistance and moving towards physical or emotional consumption, often through an escalating sequence of small, incremental steps rather than one large, risky move. Strip it of the specifically manipulated framing. The underlying pattern Greene is describing that meaningful connection tends to build gradually through a sequence of escalating trust and shared experience rather than happening instantly in a single interaction. It's generally consistent with what relationship research more broadly finds about how intimacy and trust actually develop between people over time. The problem is not observation that connection builds in stages. The problem is what that observation gets weaponized into a deliberate, one-sided script designed to move someone toward an outcome they haven't equally chosen or consented to at each stage along the way. Research on interpersonal attraction consistently supports a few ideas that overlap with parts of this book. Similarity and genuine shared values tend to predict deeper attraction and connection far more reliability than any specific tactic. Mutual, gradually escalating self-disclosure, sharing increasingly personal information about yourself as trust builds, and having that vulnerability reciprocated is one of the most well-supported mechanisms for building genuine closeness between people, and it echoes Greene's emphasis on gradual escalation minus the manipulative framing, and a genuine, focused attention, really listening to someone, remembering details about their life, being present with them rather than distracted, reliably makes people feel more valued and more drawn to the person giving that attention, which overlaps with what Greene describes in his ideal lover archetype, again minus the strategic, one-sided framing. Where the legitimate research and Greene's frame diverge sharply is around constant mutuality and intent. Genuine psychological research on healthy relationship formation traits these dynamics as things that happen naturally between two people with roughly equal agency, each genuinely getting to know the other, not as a set of tactics one person deploys strategically, another who is not on the process. This distinction between mutual discovery and lateral strategy is the single most important thing to carry out of this episode. The core ethical issue with rating this book as a lateral book is that it frames another person's psychology as a set of levers to be pulled toward an outcome the seducer wants, often without the other person's full, informed, equal participation in that process, and that framing sits uncomfortably close to manipulation regardless of how elegantly it is historically dressed up. There is a meaningful difference between genuinely getting to know someone, being authentically interested in them, and letting closeness develop mutually versus studying someone's psychology specifically in order to strategically produce a desired response in them. The first is basically what healthy relationships are made of. The second, even it produces short-term success, tends to produce relationships built on a symmetry of intent that the other person never agreed to be part of. It's also worth noting plainly that someone of the specific tactics cataloged across this book, deliberate withholding of information, engineered emotional high and lows, calculated up predictability specifically designed to create anxious attachment, overlap uncomfortably with partners that show up in genuinely manipulative or even abusive relationship dynamics when used with that intent. Recognizing these patterns has a real defensive value, knowing that manufactured unpredictability or engineered scarcity feels like from the outside can help you notice when someone may be using them on you. Using this book as an offensive playbook to deploy those same patterns on someone else is a very different and much more ethically troubling application of the same information. The attention and tension mechanism Greene describes shows up constantly in marketing and branding, limited releases, wait lists, and deliberately incomplete product reveals all lean on the same psychological pull toward scarcity and ambiguity that he catalogs in romantic seduction. Recognizing the pattern in an advertisement is a lot easier and a lot less ethically fraught than recognizing it in a person, which is part of why studying this book through a marketing or persuasion lens rather than a purely romantic one is genuinely useful and much less ethically loaded application of the same underlying material. The same pattern shows up in political charisma and leadership as well. Greene explicitly draws some of these case studies from political and military history rather than purely romantic conquest, and the mechanism of engineered unpredictability, calculated scarcity of access, and intense undivided attention when it is given all show up in how certain public figures build powerful flows. Being able to name these mechanisms when you see a public figure using them gives you a kind of psychological literacy that's protective, not manipulative. You are better equipped to notice when your own attention and loyalty are deliberately cultivated through a recognizable technique, rather than mistaking that cultivated pull for a spontaneous, organic reaction of your own. This reframing is, I think, the most defensible way to get a real value out of this particular book. Treat it less as a manual for how to seduce a specific person and more as field guide to a set of attention and influence mechanisms that show up across romance, marketing, and leadership alike, useful primarily for recognizing when they are being used on you, and for thinking honestly about whether you would ever want to use them on someone else without their full equal participation in the process. Say, you are getting to know someone you are genuinely interested in, and you want that connection to develop in a healthy way. Take the mystery inside, apply it honestly. You don't need to manufacture false intrigue or withhold information strategically, but you also don't need to front-load your entire life history in the first conversation, letting someone get to know you gradually, because that's simply how genuine familiarity naturally unfolds. Is different from deliberately engineering incompleteness as a tactic, even though both can look similar from their outside. Take the attention inside, apply it honestly, genuinely listen to someone, remembering what they have told you, and being present with them is one of the most reliable things that actually deepens connection. And unlike Greene's framing, this works precisely because it is sincere, not because it's a calculated performance of interest. Take the gradual escalation inside, apply it honestly. Allow trust, closeness to build at a pace both people are actually comfortable with, checking in genuinely along the way rather than following a predetermined sequence designed to move someone toward an outcome regardless of their actual evolving comfort level behind the target framing entirely. The moment you notice yourself thinking about another person primarily in terms of what psychologically type they are and what level that type responds to, rather than as a full individual you are genuinely curious about, that's a signal to step back from the tactical mindset the book encourages and return to actual mutual curiosity instead. That's the responsible version of engaging with this book content, genuinely useful in parts, but only once separated from its more troubling framing. Thanks for your listening. See you in the next book.